Hi, this is Valerie Leonard, your host for today. We will be getting started in about 5 minutes or so. It's about 9:56. We indicated that we would start at 10 o'clock. Just want to give you an opportunity to sign in, introduce yourselves. We've got our chat room open. If there are any questions, please feel free to post. Whether or not you have any questions, we would love it if you can introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from, what you hope to get out of today's session. And again, as we go, there's a lot of material to cover. As we go on, you can feel free to post questions. I might be able to interject as we go along, but chances are I won't, but I will definitely try to address every question that you have in the live session. And any questions that we don't get to, I will definitely follow up with you. If you are a member of nonprofit Utopia, make sure that you post in our community. We should have that webinar available later on this afternoon. There'll be a special section in the community for you to review the webinar, post questions, and I can respond. Alrighty, so we will be getting started at about 10 o'clock, assuming that there will be others joining us. It's 9:58, and we'll wait for a critical mass to join us. And if we have a critical mass by 10 o'clock, we will start. If we don't have a critical mass, we'll wait about 5 minutes and then get started and let others catch up. All right. Again, thank you so much for attending. I think you will really, really enjoy what we'll be discussing today. I think it'll be very relevant to you as you start your fundraising efforts, as you get ready for Giving Tuesday, as you develop proposals, as you develop strategic plans and all that good stuff. But, I'm not going to ruin the surprise. You sit back, relax. Make sure you download your handouts. Your handouts will come in handy. We're not going to go over them verbatim as we go through this webinar, but we will review, I'll give you an overview at the end of the webinar, and then we'll go into Q&A. All righty. I will talk to you later. I see that people are starting to join us. If you could please post in the chat room, post your name, where you're from, and what you hope to get from today's session. We're going to wait a couple minutes and see if we can get a critical mass for people to come. All right, great. Sandra McCoy indicated that she's not connected. Sandra, if you could click on there's a little triangle and that you should see, click on to that icon and hit reconnect. Hopefully that should get you to the webinar room. You might see something that says connection problems and then hit reconnect, or you can hit the triangle that says start the broadcast, and you should be able to join us. And that goes for anyone else who's having problems. You might not be able to see the chat room immediately, and please try that and let me know when you get in, okay? Okay, if you're able to hear me, please check in the chat room and let me know that you're able to hear. And if you can't check in, I sent an emergency link earlier in the event that you weren't able to connect. If you're not able to get in using the Webinar Jam email, please go to the email that I sent this morning and click on to that emergency link. Hi, Rosemary, you wanted to speak? Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. In the event that we're having technical difficulty, I will make sure that you get a recording of this webinar. I do apologize if there are problems and people can't connect. Okay, good morning. My name is Valerie Leonard, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Demonstrate Need for Services in a Crowded Field. If you've not yet done so, please download the handouts. You should see 3 handouts. This includes the Asset Mapping Workbook, the Community Needs Assessment Worksheet, and a notes page. You should take notes as we go along and feel free to post any questions or comments. You should take notes as we go along and feel free to post any questions and comments you might have in the chat room. We'll have live Q&A at the end of the session. Nonprofit Utopia members will also be able to post questions in our online community later on today. So last week, we focused on 23 questions you need to answer before starting a nonprofit initiative. When we say initiative, we mean a new organization, program or service, issue advocacy campaign, etc. The operative word is new. We actually reviewed 30 questions that you should ask before starting a new initiative, and you were able to start to fill in some of your answers on the Community Needs Assessment Worksheet as we went along. We also shared an overview of the Asset Mapping Workbook to help you identify issues in the community, your priorities, and target clients. The workbook also has community asset mapping exercises, and the answers that you provide on the Community Needs Assessment Worksheet and Asset Mapping Workbook will lay the foundation for the development of your Community Needs Assessment. So that brings us to today's webinar. We'll be talking about how to demonstrate need for services in a crowded field. A community needs assessment helps us to better understand the strengths and resources available in the community to address community issues and to minimize challenges of its citizens. When viewed through the lens of asset-based community development, the assessment focuses on the capabilities of the community, and that includes its citizens, agencies, and organizations. For a number of reasons, many nonprofit leaders don't focus on community needs assessments until they're responding to a question on a funding application. Even so, they typically copy and paste the answers from previous proposals, And ideally, community needs assessment should be conducted independently of any proposal writing process. The information gleaned from the process should be used to design relevant programs and services and to make informed decisions. This webinar is designed to give you an overview of the community needs assessment process. Again, I want to remind you to download the handouts, especially the note sheet, so that you can take notes as we go along. Again, today's topic is how to demonstrate need for services in a crowded field. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about nonprofit Utopia. We are the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders, and we've created a safe environment in which our members can innovate, speak candidly about the issues and concerns they face on a daily basis, and share ideas and resources. If you want to find out more about the community, visit nonprofitutopia.mn.co. That's our subscriber community. And if you want to learn more about Nonprofit Utopia, the organization, go to nonprofitutopia.com. That is a public website. Our mission is to provide ongoing professional development and networking opportunities in which experienced nonprofit professionals can share expertise with the next generation of ethical leaders. The overarching goal of the community is to give our members the tools they need to develop strong organizations that will make a lasting impact. Our vision is to strengthen the global nonprofit sector by providing training and development opportunities for 50,000 emerging nonprofit leaders throughout the world by 2033. So I want to take this time to say thank you so much for being a part of our vision. I want to say thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I see that Sandra is having technical difficulties. Sandra, I will make sure you get a copy of this recording. I do apologize. So I want to give you a little bit of information about myself. My name is Valerie Leonard. I am a consultant and I focus in community and organizational development. I'm also a coach working with emerging leaders to help them make a greater impact to the clients and communities that they serve. I'm the founder of Nonprofit Utopia, the ideal community for emerging leaders. And I teach online courses in operations management, program development, financial management, and proposal development for UIC's online certificate in nonprofit management program. And UIC is the University of Illinois at Chicago. I have also developed Capacity Building Blocks, which is a 10-week workshop series focusing on nonprofit issues, including startup, board development, finance, and compliance. I'm the host of Nonprofit Utopia Internet Radio Show on blogtalkradio.com, and this is a forum where nonprofit stakeholders can share lessons learned in the industry. So as you can see, we have a whole lot of material to cover today. We're going to talk about conducting a needs assessment. We'll talk about the relationship between the community needs assessment, a theory of change, and program logic model development. And then we'll talk about how we can use the program logic model to conceptualize programs. And then we'll also be covering asset mapping, the 7 triggers for community needs assessment, the 4 things you must do in order to justify the need for your programs and services. We'll talk about what to do when it seems like there are too many players in the market to gain traction. And then we will talk about how to respond to funders' concerns regarding potential duplication of services. So what is asset-based community development? That's really a pretty fancy term for what we do instinctively. I guess if we look at the theoretical definition, it's a philosophy of community development that focuses on community development from the inside out. There's a belief that communities already have everything that they need to address issues, and it focuses on the positives or the assets a community has rather than focuses on lack or deficits. And essential part of the asset-based community development model is the people in the community are central to the solutions. So again, if you're a member of a church or a block club or any grassroots organization, you kind of feel that anyway, you kind of know that anyway, and you focus on the assets that are around you. So a community needs assessment is a way of gauging opinions, assumptions, needs, key issues, and or assets within a defined community. And we're using the definition that comes from Charlie French, who wrote this for an article, Community Needs Assessment Tools for the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension. So there are a number of reasons why you want to conduct a community needs assessment. For example, the most common reason is to develop a proposal. Typically, as I said before, we don't even think about this until after we're responding to questions to a funding proposal. But other reasons include developing new programs and to improve existing programs, to describe the current lay of the land or understand the situation, so to speak, identify community needs, concerns, and issues, to develop marketing strategies, to galvanize grassroots action around needs or issues, determine whether or not the needs have changed, to collect communities' hopes, dreams, and desires on a collective basis, and to make sure that programs remain relevant. So you want to make sure that whatever you build, you're not just building it and hoping that people will come. You're building it based on what the community has expressed that they need and they want. So there are 7 triggers for community needs assessment. The first one is starting a new organization. For example, when you do your 501c3 application, you have to demonstrate that there's a need for the organization that you propose. You would use a community needs assessment whenever you're doing a business planning process or strategic planning process, developing a proposal or a case for support, starting or expanding a program, as I mentioned before, starting or expanding a service, rolling out a new product, conducting an issue or advocacy campaign. So those are the 7 triggers. Those are the common triggers. And typically when you do a community needs assessment, again, we have a sense that we know our communities, we work in our communities every day, we interact with our clients every day, but it's much more sound to focus or to ground everything that you're doing in research. And there are a number of research methods. And when I say research methods, please don't be intimidated. You don't need to be a PhD in order to engage in these research methods. And basically, research methods is just a fancy way of saying, how do we collect information and data? And what do we do with that data? And how are we going to use those data to actually make decisions and to make sure that whatever we're doing is focused on community needs and is responsive and not necessarily us dictating to the community what we think the community should have. So one way of doing that is through quantitative methods. And quantitative methods are basically those things that can be measured, they can be counted and analyzed numerically. So some examples include financial data, census statistics, statistics that you might develop in-house, for example, clients served, the number of housing units that you develop, et cetera, et cetera. And you really want to use quantitative methods when you want to determine cause and effect, and you want to establish a baseline. And most commonly, we want to look at the baseline level of knowledge or our attitudes, or maybe the baseline of the condition of a community. And then you'll do a similar analysis sometime in the future, and then you'll look at what has changed, and that will tell you, what has been gained or what has been lost. On the other hand, numbers don't tell us everything. We want to get behind the numbers. So one way of doing that is through qualitative methods. And qualitative methods focus on direct contact with the people involved in a program. And that could be things like interviews, focus groups. And focus groups are nothing more than group interviews. And you typically in your focus group want to have people who have similar backgrounds and experiences so you can advance your conversation to a higher level. Other qualitative methods include observation. You might observe a program in action or a class in action, document review, public meetings. And again, these are used most appropriately to get behind the numbers, gather multiple viewpoints, and to understand feelings and attitudes about oneself, about a specific program or organization, or changes in the environment. And the qualitative methods combined with the quantitative methods help give you a much more well-rounded picture. So there are three major ways to collect these data. The first way is through empirical studies. And when we say empirical studies, that's just a fancy way of saying, what data can we collect through our own experiences, through our own observations, or our clients' own experiences or observations. So one way to do that is to develop questionnaires and surveys. Another way is to read researchers' reports. And a third way is to conduct interviews and focus groups of clients and stakeholders. A second way to collect the data includes spatial studies. Now, spatial studies is typically, looking at geographic data and looking at some of the patterns. So you might generate maps by plotting data along census tracts or streets. And you might want to get a sense for what's going on at a block level. And when I say block level, I'm talking about census block levels, neighborhood levels, community levels, city level, state, county, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to define your geography and look at patterns and how those patterns are distributed geographically. So, for example, how would poverty be distributed? When you see a map where poverty is geocoded, you might see certain colors that are related to high poverty, and then other colors that are related to relatively low poverty. And you can download many of these maps from the internet. You can also use the internet to create your own maps. If you're fortunate enough to know somebody who can geocode your data to create maps, then you should do that. Other data can be gotten from the Census Bureau. So go to census.gov, go to other public records, and you can download those data, demographic data, economic data, jobs data, data regarding ex-offenders. Obviously you go to different public websites, but, public websites are a good source for data. So where can you find the data? In Chicago, if you really want to understand what's going on in Chicago, and I warn you that the Chicago data portal has probably more data than you ever want to see. You will see patterns that are hidden in in broad daylight. But, for those of us who are data nerds, it's a really good adventure. So you can go there. It's an open data portal, and you can find, many facts about your neighborhood, block club data and housing data, data that you may not be interested in, but it's a very, very interesting portal. Another portal is from the Preservation Compact, and they bring together data on the region's public, private, and nonprofit leaders that, the data that they're using to preserve affordable multifamily rental housing in Cook County. So those are just two examples, and there are many, many data websites, and they will vary. If you need to go to CPS to get data on performance, you can go there. If you need to find police statistics, you can go to the police department. If you need statistics from the library, you can go to the Chicago Public Library. Another source for spatial data is the City of Chicago GIS systems, and the census.gov website also has spatial data, and you can generate your own maps. So other community needs assessment tools include literature review, and you're basically looking at research that others have done, and that will help you really get a grasp for the issues, what works, what doesn't work, and then it helps you to position the research that you're doing so you can actually have an original bent on it based on the data that you generate from your own studies or based on your own observations to make it unique, for your specific organization, your specific community. And obviously you need to cite these data sources. And even if it's your own data, that makes it that much more powerful. You can demonstrate that your organization is, a thought leader on gathering those statistics. You do that enough and people start coming to you. Another community needs assessment tool is asset mapping. And asset mapping is used to map the location of the assets a community has at its disposal. So that's in the literal sense. And there's another way to do asset mapping, and that is to actually create flowcharts and other diagrams that are more abstract, and we'll go into that. But the purpose of an asset map, regardless of whether it's a literal map where you're mapping assets or it's an abstract drawing where you're kind of describing the assets, is to divert your focus from the deficits or the needs and focus on the positive attributes and how those assets can be used to solve your problems or address your issues, so to speak. So again, as I indicated before, focus group discussions are group interviews for the most part, and then public meetings, you can gather those data. In both instances, you look at the notes from the focus groups and from the public meetings. You might also use that as an opportunity to gain feedback from people, issue surveys, share your findings, and get a sense for what people think about your findings thus far. Those could be very, very powerful methods of helping you to assess what the needs and the issues are in the community. So when we look at our asset mapping framework, typically, and you can break it down even further or less detailed, but typically there are 7 major components. The first component is individuals. The second is local associations. The third is organizations, and then local institutions. So those are the first 4. And when we speak of individuals, we typically are more interested in the folks who live in the community, who have a real stake in what's going on in the community. And you're looking, um, you know, not only for residents, ideally it's residents, but, there may be other organizations where people work there and they don't necessarily live in the community. So you might also look at stakeholders who live, work, play, or worship, or regularly participate in activities in the community, and get a sense for what it is that's on their minds. What are their issues? What do they think are good ways to address the issues? Local associations, those are those informal organizations. They're not necessarily chartered organizations. They may be a ministry within a church. They may be a group of organizations who have just come together to address a certain issue. It could be athletic clubs, other faith-based groups, block clubs that don't necessarily have their charter, be formal organizations that are at least chartered by the state and are going through their tax exemption process, local institutions, and that can include churches, public spaces, schools, libraries, parks, government entities, and those nonprofits that have become multi-million or multi-billion dollar agencies. They've reached a mature phase where they're considered institutions. The last three types of assets are your physical assets, economic assets, and stories. And your physical assets include things like land, buildings, transportation infrastructure, and other facilities that can contribute to the community strengthening, but most importantly, those assets that can contribute to the goals and objectives you determine after looking at the community. Economic assets, those include what the residents produce and consume in the community, and that can also include both formal and informal ways through local businesses, bartering and trading relationships that can contribute. And then, one measure that we often use is the number of times a dollar turns over before it leaves the community. And one often overlooked asset is the community stories. And this is especially true in those communities that are changing. If we're not careful, if we don't document our stories, then the whole character of the neighborhood, the whole narrative of the neighborhood could change and really lead up to further gentrification. So stories are very, very important. They carry the memory of a community and they can describe the potential of a community based on previous times that people have come to recollect. So a good way of documenting those stories might be through oral histories or working with a historian to actually document it in writing, do the research, but never ever let your current community story be forgotten. Those stories can be used as rallying points for community development. So another way of looking at asset mapping, looking at abstract maps. So I don't know what this drawing is. It really reminds me of a stomach or some lungs or something like that. But this was a very abstract drawing put together by the Indianapolis Neighborhood Resource Center. They identified the community's needs. So unemployment was an issue, truancy was an issue, broken families, however they define broken families, was an issue, gangs, child abuse, and I'm not going to read everything on the list, but apparently they did a convening and these are the issues that bubbled to the top of what was on the neighbors' minds. So when they mapped the solution, they started with, what do we have in the community already that might be able to help us address those issues? So they looked at the businesses, they looked at parks, which is one of the institutions. They looked at places of worship, which is another institution. They looked at the income level and the collective income of the community. They looked at the youth. They looked at senior citizens, artists, and the list goes on. Again, I'm not going to read everything here, but they looked at everything that they have right now that they can begin to address some of those issues that they identified. So that's people, places, and other assets, institutions, organizations. And this is a literal map. This is a map that I use to help an organization I was working with to demonstrate need for senior housing in Austin. And basically, this is a map of the availability of senior housing and the type of housing that was available. And we were able to use this map to demonstrate that, yes, there are senior housing developments in Austin, but there's still a need because there's an unmet need. A number of people are aging in their homes and they're no longer able to go upstairs. They're living in buildings that are over 100 years old and are no longer accessible, and there are only X number of qualified senior units in the whole community. Austin is the largest community. So these maps can be a very, very powerful tool, and you can look, at a glance at what some of the issues are. And again, when we talk about geocoding of data and then being able to see, the different colors representing, the level, in this case, the number of senior households. So we showed that Austin was amongst the most densely populated and had the highest number of senior-headed households in the whole city of Chicago. And we were able to demonstrate that with this map. Okay, and I'm not going to belabor that point, but I think you get what I mean, how powerful this can be. You can show at a glance that, there is a need because there's a great number of households that are headed by seniors, and you can show that there, even while there are institutions serving the community, there aren't nearly enough. So what do the data suggest? So you got to look at all those data, look at the empirical studies, look at the financial data, look at the numeric data, spatial data, census tract data, put all of that stuff together, and that begins to weave your story. So with the empirical studies, that will help you to determine the types of needs, the severity of the need, and who specifically is in need. So again, remember the empirical studies, those are the studies of actual observations, observations you make, observations your subjects and clients have, and you can get those data through surveys, through interviews, focus groups, and all that good stuff. Spatial studies, the maps. Where are the problems? Where are the current and potential clients? The types and tenure and condition of housing, for example. And, that's just one example. You could do spatial studies on health, to look at the distribution of diabetes, to look at the distribution of toxic waste sites and all that good stuff. So it doesn't necessarily have to be focused on housing. It could show you land use. And when we talk about land use, we're literally looking at, is that land being used by institutions such as churches and schools and government? Is it being used for housing? Is it being used for business? Is it being used for open space? Spatial studies can also tell you what the areas of highest concentration of people who have that need. And then, if you do a number of maps over time, it can tell you what those trends are over time. And the census tract data and other public records can tell you who those potential clients are, where they live, where they're located. The types and tenure of housing is one example. You can also get economic data from the census. You can also look at public records to better understand what's going on with schools in terms of performance, where the kids go, what their levels of poverty are. You can find out where the people are located, either where they live, where they go to school, where they go to work, where they play, etc., depending on what your study is. So that brings us to a theory of change. And basically, once you have all of that information, obviously you're starting a new organization or a new initiative, a new product or service, because you want to make a difference in the community. So you might consider developing a theory of change. And a theory of change describes a process of planned social change, and that includes assumptions that guide its design to the long-term goals it seeks to achieve. And I got that definition from the Ford Foundation. They have a publication, Mapping Change, using a theory of change to guide planning and evaluation. A theory of change, so that's going to be the basis for your studying the community. Is going to be the basis for a program logic model, and then implementing your program as well as evaluating the program. And it basically is a blueprint for the work ahead, and it anticipates the likely effects of the work that you do, and then it reveals what should be evaluated, when and how, and by whom really, and what data you're going to need. So in this very simple model, you start off with the organization's mission, and based on the data that you glean from the community, you make certain assumptions, because you'll never have 100% of the information that you need, but you'll be able to make assumptions from the data that you collect, be it qualitative, with a more human aspect, or be it quantitative, which is more numeric. And then you look at the needs and the impact on your target population. And then based on those three things, you develop strategies, you develop programs, you develop issue advocacy campaigns, you develop new products and services. Whatever this new thing is you set out to do, you want to take into account your mission, assumption, and target needs. And then you do a reflection on that. You look at what the outcomes were and whether those outcomes were actually the intended outcomes. And whatever you learn from that, you pour it back into your program or whatever initiative that is to improve it. And sometimes that might mean tweaking your mission a bit. Sometimes we work ourselves out of a mission because our communities might change. So all of that becomes, again, the groundwork for a program logic model. And basically, a program logic model is a diagram that helps you to develop a program. And you can see in a snapshot, what the current environment or situation is within a community, and where you want the program or service or whatever it is you want to do to operate. You can develop major goals and objectives based on that current situation. You can identify the resources that are required to operate the program. You can identify the activities that are required to meet the goals. You can also indicate what your desired change will be as a result of implementing the programs, and those are your outcomes. And there are many, many, many ways that you can do this, but my favorite depiction of the program logic model is adapted from the University of Wisconsin Extension Program, and this is their action model. And what I like about this model is it starts out with the situation analysis, but it also includes ongoing evaluation. All too often, we start developing programs. We don't think about how it's going to be evaluated. And as a result, we don't design it in such a way that we're collecting the data that we need to develop a robust evaluation that can actually attract more resources for our programs. So the way this works is you do a situation analysis, answering all 23 of those questions that we talked about last week, taking into account the research methods that we need, blah, 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 blah. So we want to look at what's going on at the macro level. So these are big picture developments, and this could happen at the national level, state level, policy. It could be Cook County or whatever county you might live in. It could be the city. It could be your local community. So these are all big picture kinds of things that could impact the work that you're trying to do. And then when we look at the micro level, we're talking about very local. It could be city, but more often it's our local block, our local community, our organization, and with our clients. So based on what's happening in our environment, what are our goals and objectives? What are we really trying to achieve to make this world a better place? So then we look at our inputs or our activities. We look at what we invest. What do we have already? Things like money, staff time, equipment, and supplies, and all of that stuff is at varying levels depending on where you are in your development. We look at what we need, and the things that we need, we have to go out and get. So that could be additional staff. It could be training, more expertise. Then we look at who is it that we want to reach? So who is our target market? And then what do we do what do we do for our target? Do we do programs? Do we do services? And then we look at what we want to change as a result of the work that we do. So we're looking at how our clients or our community is going to be impacted by the work that we do. Short term, long term, or in the intermediate. And then we want to look at how it's going to be evaluated. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we're also making allowances for data collection and understanding who's going to collect the data, what the data is going to support. And generally we want our data to support things like outputs, which is our productivity and the activities, and we want our data to support the outcomes, which is what it is we expect to change. So what are the 4 things you have to do in order to demonstrate need for a new initiative? First thing you want to do is identify key issues of concern to the community, because the community can need all it wants. You can identify needs all day long, but if the community doesn't think it's a concern or an issue, then it's really not an issue. You identify people who are most impacted. And then the third step is to identify gaps in service and or opportunities to introduce new services. And then 4, again, kin to number 1, make sure that it's of concern to the community. But 4, you got to demonstrate the demand, because again, the community can need things all day long, but if if there is not a demand on their part, then you have just developed a new initiative and it will have a very hollow ring. So how do you respond to funders' concern regarding potential duplication of services? Now, these are some strategies that have worked for me when I have run an organization myself, when I have helped people develop proposals, and when I've helped them prepare for meetings with their funders. Some of the strategies that have been effective is to identify unmet needs. I live in a community where there are over 200 nonprofits, and And then on top of that, over 187 churches and faith-based organizations. So the first question is, why do you need another nonprofit? So we have to, in those instances, again, begin to identify unmet needs. So you peel the onion back. Is there a specific age group that's not being met? Or is this something where there's a wide range of services and people tend to focus on the outer ranges and not the middle ranges of the services in what we call a continuum? You might consider collaboration, and you might also look at collective impact. And collective impact that's a more intense way of collaborating, because what you're looking to do is impact an entire sector within a community. So you're working with all of the major players in, say, housing, or all of the major players in education within a community, so that everybody in the community is served. So rather than looking at your 25 people, or organization Y is looking at their 50 people, you're looking at all 10,000 people in the community who might be impacted by a certain issue. You want to also differentiate yourself through innovative approaches. One of the favorite questions is, what makes you different? I was just working with a client yesterday, and he was focusing on expungement. And someone asked him, well, what makes your program different? And he indicated that the thing that makes his program different is they have people who are holding hands of people who are recently out of prison, from the day that they go and pick up their rap sheet to the day that they have a job. They're not necessarily depending or letting these people fend for themselves. They have a navigator, so to speak, that will help them to go through the complex systems of going all the way from being released from prison to finding a job. And that's a very, very complicated process. Another thing is to focus on unique value propositions. Yes, nonprofits need to realize that they, in fact, have value. So often we go hat in hand to donors and to other funders and to the government, saying, please give us money, but we don't think about the value that we bring to the equation, value that the government needs to get their work done, value that foundations need. There are certain things that nonprofits can do that governments and foundations can't do because they don't have the relationships or the expertise. So what do you do when it seems like there are too many players in the market to gain traction? First thing you want to do is leverage the relationships that you have with community stakeholders. You want to make sure that your position in their minds as the first organization to go to when they need a service, when they need a partner, when they want to fund an organization, for the individual donors. You need to solidify relationships with funders. That means letting them get to know you better and know your wins and your approaches, letting them know what your struggles are and how you're dealing with your struggles, and most importantly, how you can help them to meet their goals and objectives. If you can demonstrate that you're able to meet their goals and objectives better than the next person, then next organization, then your organization will become the go-to organization. It doesn't matter how many thousands of organizations are in your community. You want to engage. So that means engaging community stakeholders in things like planning and implementation of programs. So you don't want to just come to the community when you have a problem. You don't want to just come to the community and give out turkeys. You actually want to be able to use the information that they have to inform your program or service. You want to become a thought leader in your area of service and expertise. Again, when people think of housing, if you're a housing organization, you want them to think of you first. When they think of education and you're into education, you want them to think of your organization first. You can also differentiate yourself through quality and innovative approaches. You can strengthen your website and social media presence, and that's something that nonprofits need to do more of, being more visible and engaging on social media. And then enhance your brand and total customer experience. So you can differentiate yourself through having a superior brand and customer experience. And when I talk about brand, I'm talking about the total experience. I'm not talking just about the logo. I'm not talking just about marketing materials, but it's that total experience that people feel from interacting with your organization from start to finish, and how they remember you and how they're able to go and talk about what it is that you do. So I want to share an example from prisoner reentry. If you were to do a community needs assessment, some things that you might consider would be how many ex-offenders are returning to the community on a weekly, monthly, or annual basis. And you can find those data in public documents, literature reviews, from talking to people who do this work. You want to know who's impacted by their return, their family, their victims, the community itself, the businesses. Understand what problems returning citizens face. And you can do that through surveys, literature reviews, interviews. And then another question you might want to ask is, what do they need to successfully transition back into society as productive citizens? Again, you can find that information out through literature reviews, interviews of them and people who do the work, and focus groups, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just one example, and you can apply many, many different subsectors of the nonprofit industry to that example. So generally speaking, when we do the community needs assessment process, the first step is to define the scope. And all those 30 questions that we answered last week, those will help you to define the scope. What is the magnitude of the issue? Who are you trying to impact? What's the geography of the issue? What are the problems? Who's already doing this work? Again, look at those the questions from last week's webinar, and that will help you. And we've also included a workbook for those of you who didn't attend last week's webinar that will help you define the scope. Step 2 is to decide whether or not you want to do this by yourself. And when I say by yourself, that could be someone who is thinking about starting a nonprofit organization, or the organization is going to work by itself. Or is it better to work as a team and collaborate? And if and when you do collaborate on this work, be very, very clear that there is a clear memorandum of understanding or even a contract in place that will outline roles, responsibilities, and consequences for not following through, so that you protect yourself. You want to collect the data. Then you want to analyze it and determine key findings. Step 5, you want to set priorities and then create an action plan. And then step 6, you want to share your findings. So, you can do your report and have any number of outlines, but I find that this outline is pretty helpful. An introduction where you're really given an overview of the community, the organization, your mission, vision, and goals. You talk about the purpose for this particular assessment and what it is you want to get out of it. You will talk about the research methods and the way you'll collect the data. You'll analyze the data. And then your next section, we'll talk about the implications. So given what we have learned, what does that really mean for the community or for other interested stakeholders? Then you determine the recommended actions. And then, if you want to be ambitious, you can think about the resources needed to address the issue. And when I say ambitious, you can look at it from a community-wide perspective. Whatever target area you're trying to impact, look at what it would take to address that issue. And given the collective resources that it would need, what about your little corner of the world? What resources will your organization need to address the issue? And then you look at the cost estimates of addressing the issue. Then you develop an action plan, and then you'll include your appendices. And your appendices could be all of those research tools and analyses that you have talked about. And you can also put, a description of your partners and the roles that they play. So your community needs assessment is not just this, this exercise in, ivory tower analysis, but it is also an opportunity for you to engage other people in the community, engage your potential funders, engage potential partners in the community, and really put you on the road to being a thought leader. And you can use information from this particular document to actually respond more intelligently or more efficiently in your grant proposals. As I mentioned before, we typically don't think about the community needs assessment until we're responding in 500 words or less what the needs of the community are. If we have this document already prepared, we can just summarize in 4 or 5 paragraphs and be very, very succinct and very, very complete at the same time what the needs are and give a very much more well-reasoned response. So you're being more proactive rather than reactive. So that brings us to the end of this discussion. And I'm going to leave this slide here. If you have any questions regarding this webinar, you can email me at ValerieFLeonard at nonprofitutopia.com. And if you're a member of Nonprofit Utopia, you can post in our course forum in the community. And I would love for you guys to join our community at nonprofitutopia.mn.co. And, you will find access to courses, other webinars, other resources, a number of activities that we do. We have several activities per month. We offer encouragement to one another on our goals and objectives. We also have access to a pretty good network of people who will help you with your issues. And if you have questions of me, I can respond. And there are other experts in that forum who can respond. And you can find us on Facebook at Nonprofit Utopia on our Facebook page. So at this point, if you have any questions, please post them in our forum. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. And while I'm waiting for you to post your questions and comments, I just want to direct your attention to our asset mapping workbook. The asset mapping workbook will really help you to formulate your ideas that you need to develop your community needs assessment. You will learn to identify issues, identify your target market, and go through the process of developing an asset map that will include people, institutions, financial assets, etc., for the community. And you can develop goals and objectives based on that. And then this asset mapping process will help you identify potential partners and clients that could be impacted or that can help you solve these problems. And then I also, even before you do that, I ask that you do the before you start, or I recommend that you do the before you start community needs assessment worksheet. That is a list of all those questions that we asked in last week's webinar. You can jot your answers down, and those answers can be used to inform your community needs assessment. So without further ado, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I'm going to ask one more time if there are any questions. And if there are no more questions, I am going to end this webinar here. And I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. And I look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.